As I said to you earlier, it was really about 15 months ago where these things came home to me more personally than they ever had. Not that I hadn't thought about it 33 months ago, but I don't think I wrestled with them 33 months ago. And I decided that I was going to follow Thoreau's advice and dedicate myself to those things that I could do differently. Not to do business pursuits that were if I didn't have to. In other words, some business things I still have to do because we still have a business. But to do the extra things, to go the extra mile, to give my time to those things instead of Bible study, for instance, I decided I wouldn't do it anymore. And Lois said to me, well, what if it affects our lifestyle or do those things? I said, I fully expect it to. I expect to have to live a little bit differently because I've changed priorities. Not that God wasn't the priority in my life. He just wasn't the priority with the distance between God and everything else as it should have been. If you understand what I'm saying, instead of God being here and everything else being here, I wanted the gap to widen. I wanted God to be here and everything else to be down here. So I set out to do that by allocating time. And maybe you're wrestling with these same things. I hope you are. The vanity of worldly goods was really driven home this past year to a lot of people by their vanishing in the stock market demise and these things. But also, just in general, I started to fortify myself with wise men and what they'd said about money, and I realized wise men have one thing in common. They don't have a very high regard for money. I don't care what century they're born in, they won't have a high regard for something as transient and undependable as money is. And here I was, believing very much in the effectiveness and the relative value of money, which I, the whole time saying to you, well, it's transient in nature. So I was bearing down to make sure my thinking lined up with some of these wise men of the ages. And one of the things that occurred to me was a quote I'd heard by a guy named G.K. Chesterton, who was a famous wit of sort, and he always says things in a funny way. But here he says, to be clever enough to make a great deal of money, one must be stupid enough to want it. And I started realizing, well, there you go. He's kind of given you a category I hadn't wanted to be in that. To be stupid enough to want it, there's only half of his particular equation here. So I thought about that a lot, and I wonder if that appeals to you, that you got to be stupid to want it. And I read a quote by a man that I often quote, a man named Matthew Henry, who said, if money was rightly understood, you'd flee from it rather than pursue it. Now think about that. If money were rightly understood, you'd flee from it rather than pursue it. Why? Well, what happened to Demas, if you remember, in Pilgrims' Progress, and what happens to him in 2 Timothy is he deserts God for the world. Why? His heart was here. His heart was in this world, and therefore it was his treasure was in this world, and he pursued it with all his might, and eventually it cost him his eternal soul, his happiness. He took a momentary happiness and preferred it over an eternal happiness. I didn't want to be Demas. Bunyan doesn't want you to be Demas. In this story now, when we return to Pilgrim's Progress, you're going to see the next sad thing is, if you might remember if you've been watching every week, that they had this argument previously, Christian and Hopeful, with a man named Mr. Buy-ins from the town of Fair Speech. And he has companions, Mr. Love This World, Mr. Money Love, all these guys who are all about making money. And I was saying, well, it's very hard for it not to sound like Winnetka to me when I'm there. But you see that all of a sudden, Christian and Hopeful escaped Demas's influence. And in fact, they were very hard on Demas because Christian is wary of him. He's heard of him. And then Mr. Buy-ins comes along with his companions. And of course, when Demas says to them, stop by here, you can have a silver mine, for goodness sakes. People are mining this stuff. It's coming so fast. And these guys all believing themselves to be true believers, join with Demas, believing himself to be a true believer, and they give their hearts to chasing silver and gold. And Bunyan says, you know, the last I heard of them, they sort of fell into one of those pits and were never heard of again. They didn't make it to the celestial city. They got sidetracked, and it's a sad thing. Now, the way that Bunyan is so clever in his writing is these men get sidetracked, fall into a pit, and are forever lost. Just when you're feeling really good about Christian and hopeful, they're going to make the same mistake for another reason. Their feet start to hurt them. The path of a pilgrim is hard. The path is bumpy and rough and rocky, and they start to have their feet hurt, and they want some ease. And there's a little meadow off the side of the road that looks like it runs parallel to the road. And Christian says to hopeful, why don't we take the meadow? We can still see the road. But you see, every step you take off of the narrow road to the celestial city is a dangerous one. And our friends who just lost their walking companions to the pursuit of riches are now about to themselves to be lost for the sake of ease. So when we come back, we'll see how dangerous it is not to stay on the straight and narrow. Thanks.
As I traveled on my journey, few and far between.
As I've mentioned, you know, our duo here, Christian and Hopeful, their feet are hurting. The road of a pilgrim is long and it is hard. There's no doubt about it. This world is a briar patch. It's not easy to get through it. You don't get to travel with a lot of friends. You do suffer if you sign up to be a Christian. At least you should. If you're not suffering as a Christian, you need to be doubtful about your Christianity. A famous man, Thomas Brooks, once said, the Lord had one son without corruption, none without correction. If the path isn't hard enough on its own, the Lord in his chastenings will make the path rough for you as he grinds away at your mistaken ideas of life and your attachments to this world. Remember, if God didn't chasten you once in a while, you'd make a heaven out of this particular moldy old planet. So God has that. Now, I want to take a little detour because I've really been talking about how life is hard for a pilgrim. But life is equally hard for unbelievers. When you watch people, as I do, and just observe their lives, it amazes you how difficult life really is. They have all manner of difficulty, from financial to, children who are handicapped, to, children who are absolutely rebellious, to business problems and partners and different things. It's not easy to go through this world as a believer. It's much more difficult, I'm convinced, as an unbeliever, because you're a slave to your lusts and other things that are really driving you to, and you don't even know you are a slave to them. You're just being driven and you think it's what you want, when in fact there's somebody else and something else always driving you. You're out of control. And I was thinking of a story as an unbeliever. Here's kind of your situation if you're an unbeliever. There's a story in 2 Kings, about chapter 7, I think. And the good guys are holed up in the city of Samaria, and they've been rebellious, and so God's letting them be chastened. And it's gotten so bad, the famine in Samaria, that people are eating dung from pigeons, and it takes 2 pounds of silver to buy a donkey's head, something that nobody would ever eat at another time. The horses have almost been eaten. There's a sad story of a woman who comes to the king and says, I think it's going to be King Jehoram, although he's not mentioned by name. And she says to him, yesterday we ate my son. Now, today we were supposed to eat the other woman's son, but she won't share him. I mean, it's just one of those pathetic, sad things that Jeremiah is lamenting in Jeremiah chapter 2. And you realize it's a pathetic thing in the city. The Syrians are camped out here, and the Syrians are a formidable force at this point, getting ready to besiege the walls of Samaria and murder these people. And in between, right outside the walls, are 4 lepers. The lepers live in a little house probably by themselves. They're not allowed to go inside the city because they're not ceremonially clean. And they're afraid of the Syrians who are coming. So they have this little powwow, and they say to themselves, look, they won't let us in the city, but even if they would, we'd go in there and starve with them. What good does that do us? The Syrians are coming, and they're going to kill us. Maybe what we ought to do is go talk to the Syrians now and try to make peace. Maybe they'll show pity on us. The worst that can happen is the Syrians will kill us. And that's a little better than starvation anyway, so let's just go. So they wait till twilight, and they bravely and resolutely approach the Syrian camp, hoping for mercy from people who weren't very merciful. And lo and behold, by the time they get there, the providence of God has made the Syrian army hear chariots and horses and throw away their armor and all their goods and run for their lives, as Elisha had predicted. And overnight, the world is about to change because God decided it. And these men, after a moment of selfishness, return and say, tell the king the Syrians are fled. Well, I was thinking, as an unbeliever, there comes a time when you have to make that choice. You are unclean as an unbeliever. Really, you aren't fit for good company. The church has no use for you, and it shouldn't. You won't listen. You're really a filthy influence if we let you in. It's a privilege to be a member of a church. It's not a right. So that works. You can't get inside the wall. You stand where you are. The one thing I know is you're in trouble. You're caught between this opposing force, in this case God, who's coming to take an account of your life, and no refuge. The best thing you can do is what those lepers did. You can admit you're a leper and go to God while you're still able and hope that he'll be merciful. The difference is where the Syrians were very unmerciful people, and these lepers' prospect of mercy, finding mercy was slim. With God, everyone who goes to him will find him merciful. If you'll admit you're a leper, if you'll really go and not boast about who you are or what you are, or call yourself something you're not, God will listen to you. And I've never known him not to be merciful. I myself was a leper, unfit for human kind of affiliation, but certainly fit to go to God and beg for mercy and to ask him to heal me. Just as all lepers need healing, that's what lepers want. Blind people want sight. Lepers want clean skin. That's something that you can do as an unbeliever. If you care at all for yourself, you can size up the situation and say, am I really a slave to my lust? The answer is yes. Is it certain that God's going to come and take an account? Yes. Will I pass that accounting? No. Will I be destroyed forever? Yes. Then run to him, ask for mercy, and you'll find it. Please tune in next week, and we'll catch up with our poor wayward boys as they step off the straight and narrow. Thanks.
I shall see the great King in his beauty when I've gone the last mile of the way. When I've gone the last mile of the way, I'll rest. I said I'll rest. I'm gonna rest. I'll rest at the close of the day. And I know there are joys, Lord, waiting for me when I go.